Cold War threatened the world as it was a geopolitical chess match between the United States, the Soviet Union, and both parties' allies. The Central Powers sought to project their respective ideologies with propaganda across the globe in the wake of colonialism's collapse following World War II. The United States Department faced a painful moral dilemma. How could they use diplomacy to persuade the image of a tolerant America abroad when the country still practiced Jim Crow segregation and racial equality remained an unrealized dream? The answer was jazz. Throughout the 1920s, jazz seeped into nearly every aspect of American culture. Everything from fashion and poetry to the civil rights movement was touched by its influence. For example, the clothing style changed to make it easier to dance to the blues, and even poetry evolved as a result of jazz, which resulted in jazz poetry becoming an emergent genre in the era. This is why some people consider jazz as America's classical music. Jazz developed in the United States in New Orleans near the mouth of the Mississippi River, which played a key role in this development. The city's population was more diverse than anywhere else in the South, and people of African, French, Caribbean, Italian, German, Mexican, and American Indian, as well as English descent interacted with one another. African American musical traditions mixed with others, and gradually jazz emerged from a blend of ragtime, marches, blues, and other kinds of music. After the first recordings of jazz were made in 1917, the music spread widely and developed rapidly. The evolution of jazz was led by a series of brilliant musicians and artists, such as Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington, Charlie Parker, and many more. On the other hand, following World War I, many jazz musicians migrated from New Orleans to major northern cities. These cities consisted of Chicago, New York, and many more. This led to a wide dispersal of jazz as different styles developed in many cities throughout the country. As the 1920s progressed, the popularity of jazz rose and helped to generate a culture shift. Jazz became very significant because of the popularity of jazz in illegal nightclubs where alcohol was sold during Prohibition, speakeasies, and its rapid increase due to the emergence of more advanced recording devices. This led to many famous entertainment venues, such as the Apollo Theater and the Cotton Club, embodying the jazz age. During the Cold War, by seeking to advance their worldviews, both superpowers provided military, material, technical, and financial aid to countries they hoped to bring into their spheres of influence. Both countries formulated policies that aimed to increase their political agendas and decide when and how to intervene in the affairs of other countries. Much thought and effort went into understanding each other's motives, objectives, and strategies, and best countering them during the Cold War. One crucial method was propaganda, which was omnipresent throughout the Cold War. Propaganda was used in different techniques, forms, and degrees of delicacy. Many values were being widely promoted in film, television, music, literature, and art, which condemned communism as a political ideology and a social and economic system during the Cold War. The Cold War propaganda promoted the advantages and virtues of one's political system and criticized or demonized the other. For example, the Soviet Union used America's unrest, racial segregation, and conflicts to promote their ideological views through propaganda. The United States was experiencing a period of the Civil Rights Movement, which was a political movement and a campaign from 1954 to 1968 in the United States to abolish institutional racial segregation, discrimination, and disenfranchisement. The move had its origins in the Reconstruction era during the late 19th century from the lynchings, segregations, Ku Klux Klan, Jim Crow laws, and many more. In 1955, as the Soviet Union's pervasive propaganda about America's flaws spread globally, Congressman Adam Clayton Powell Jr. convinced President Eisenhower that jazz was the best way to intervene in the culture war. Congressman Adam Clayton Powell Jr. was an African American and had close ties with the jazz community. On the other hand, he ran for the United States Congress on a platform of civil rights in order to support fair employment practices and a ban on poll taxes and lynching regarding African Americans. President Eisenhower was particularly concerned with how internal race relations affected America's global reputation, and believed that a culture exchange program could address the majority of these problems. Therefore, Congress formed the Cultural Presentations Program in 1956. The main purpose of this program was to counteract Russian propaganda. While the program included a wide variety of cultural and artistic forms, jazz was quickly embraced by the State Department due to being an indigenous American art form. Jazz's association with African Americans also meant it could serve as a demonstration of racial equality and harmony. Dizzy Gillespie headed the first sponsored tour in March 1956, which lasted for 10 weeks. An 18-piece interracial band led by Gillespie, with Quincy Jones as music director, performed across Europe, Asia, and South America, including Iran, Pakistan, Lebanon, Turkey, Yugoslavia, Greece, and Argentina. Gillespie's first tour was a great success and provided the blueprint for a whole host more in the following decades. Gillespie's tour successfully improved America's reputation and created a template for subsequent times by other musicians. For example, in 1958, David Brubeck Quartet's 12 performances in Poland were some of the first in a long tour that would never stray far from the perimeter of the Soviet Union. They passed through mainly Eastern Europe, the Middle East, Central Asia, and the Indian subcontinent. The response to Brubeck's first concert performed in Szczecin, on the border between Poland and East Germany, was rapturous. As one stated, it was uplifting and heartbreaking at the same time. Brubeck, who was moved by the dedication of the Polish jazz fans, would often address the crowd at his performances. "No dictatorship can tolerate jazz," he said. "It is the first sign of a return to freedom." In 1960, Armstrong arrived in the Congo as a part of a tour through Africa. Many drummers and dancers paraded him through the streets. When Armstrong played in the Katanga province, a truce was called in a long-standing civil war, so people on both sides could go and see him play. Along with the 27 cities Louis Armstrong played in Africa, Armstrong toured the country of Ghana. Amid the Cold War, the country continued to practice segregation, and the United States was competing with the Soviets for influence in the Third World in order to gain access towards its resources. As an answer to this problem, they used Armstrong and the Jazz Ambassadors as their input. Prior to Armstrong's visit, Kwame Nkrumah was elected Prime Minister of the Gold Coast government in 1952 after he won the Gold Coast legislative election in 1951. Following after, the Gold Coast declared its independence from the British on March 6, 1957. This Gold Coast was named Ghana. 9 months after Armstrong's visit in Ghana, in 1960, the people approved a new constitution and elected Kwame Nkrumah as the president of a new independent Ghana. In hope of giving new momentum to Soviet-American culture exchanges, American officials sent Duke Ellington to Moscow as its jazz ambassador in 1971. During Duke's visit, an American diplomat wrote in his official report that crowds greeted the Duke as something similar to a second coming. On the other hand, one young Russian yelled, "We've been waiting for you for centuries." As a result, the jazz stars were happy to play their parts in this diplomatic cultural exchange for hearts and minds, and not as puppets. The idea was always the same: keep communism at bay by whatever means possible, and to show rather than tell other people how good America can be. Another example of fighting diplomacy overseas behind an iron curtain was Willis Conover's radio broadcast, Voice of America. As jazz was frequently banned in the Soviet Union and its satellite countries, the only way people in those countries could listen to jazz was through his broadcasts. The Jazz Ambassadors left many cultural and traditional legacies. They left behind a sense of hope in every place they toured and performed globally. On the other hand, they positively impacted many foreign audiences under communist influence and corrupt governments through the art of music, as many people would feel the essence of freedom through the smooth notes of jazz. The Jazz Ambassadors broke racial barriers and dispersed the negative racial image placed on Americans from the Soviets' propaganda. Jazz was a culture phenomenon, and it was used to comprehensively illustrate U.S. culture and society through a culture exchange program, the Jazz Ambassadors. The Jazz Ambassadors played a vital component to U.S. public diplomacy, as it can reasonably tell an American story to foreign audiences. Jazz diplomacy not only defined the success of U.S. public diplomacy in the Cold War, but became one of the most universal symbols of the United States, leaving foreign audiences to experience the American value of freedom through jazz rhythms.